you so much for this generous introduction. And thanks to everybody who's present. It's 10 o'clock, 10:15 on a Saturday morning, so that's quite some commitment. Thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Dabarati Renan for the invitation to this conference, and of course to Brianna for making it possible for me to join online. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person, and as much as I would have loved to, I decided unfortunately to cancel my travel to the US given the current fascist crackdown on activists under the Trump administration and the intensifying and draconian enforcement of borders. Was, of course, I refuse to normalize the fear. The priorities for some of us have inevitably shifted. As wonderful as it would have been to be with you all, I decided to join remotely so I can continue to do the work I do here. So thanks for accommodating for my presence today online. I will share my screen. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, super. So the title of my talk today is Sperm-Smuggling and the Labor of Life in Palestine. And will be mostly based on a piece that I had written and submitted just a few days before the genocidal onslaught against the Palestinians in Gaza. The piece was written upon invitation and the editorial support of Samira Esmir, Ramsey McLaser, and Brianna George, and it was published in Critical Times. Today, I will be revisiting this article from a different standpoint, 19 months into the genocide on Gaza. So I want to start first with a little kind of a prelude about writing in times of genocide. How is Palestinian life affirmed under conditions of death, destruction, and debilitation? What scenes of life emerge amidst and in spite of colonial violence, and in a context where a population is subjected to a state of capture and enclosure? In a place where a settler colonial regime is determined to debilitate the infrastructures and bodies that reproduce life, both biologically and socially, how does life persevere against all odds? These questions have preoccupied me in my research for the last 3 years, but since October 7th, 2023, I found it increasingly difficult to revisit them. This is despite having grown up, have come of age, studied, politically organized, written and read with Palestine and the Palestinian struggle as my political horizon. What does it mean to insist on life and life-making despite the ecocide and colonial death world that the prolonged and still unfolding durée of imperialism has ushered in? What does it mean to ask this question today through the lingua franca of the university and the optics of critical theory? And what kind of a slow labor of writing does this task demand amidst this onslaught of barbarism? A slowness that is impossible to uphold under the current conditions, and yet that is needed to labor through writing the insensible. As scholars invested in the question of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and whilst we are committed to writing, speaking, and teaching and learning about Palestine, we are today faced with the contradictions, if not at times, futility of producing scholarly and intellectual work in the midst of the horrors of the genocide. And yet, writing, teaching, learning about Palestine has never been the more urgent. Writing Palestine is a continual process of rewriting of the catastrophe, the ongoing Nakba, and the yielding struggle for liberation. It is a writing that is destined to incompletion because it is unfolding. It is also a writing of and against the plunders of the disaster that, in the words of Maurice Blanchot, ruins books and wrecks language. It is the limit of writing, but also the possibility of writing in a language unknown to man. Still, against consistent attempts at colonial erasure, epistemic and ontological, of Palestinian life, history, and present reality, it is our duty to write, speak, to protest. Even as the disaster exposes the limits of writing and of language in the face of senseless horrors, In our attempt to write it today, we also unravel hegemonic knowledge as disaster, to quote Blanchot again. As we are confronted with how Palestine has yet again shattered the whole edifice of liberal humanism and human rights as universal. We have recounted over and over and over again in the last year and a half, harrowing stories and accounts in writing and lectures and demonstrations in courts, in South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ, all to call to stop the onslaught, yet to no avail. As the liberal mindset looks away or enacts what Roderick Ferguson calls the social reproduction of cowardice, the fascist denial of these accounts doubles down on reducing Palestinians to a mere abstraction, denied existing as a body, not even as flesh. And so as I was preparing for this lecture, thinking about sperm smuggling as a life-affirming practice against the annihilating machine of the settler states, of the minor acts of rebellion from behind bars, of the labor of life that gets lost in the histories of this ongoing violence, I found myself asking the question, why insist on the labor of life amidst the full-blown relaunch of this genocidal monstrosity, amidst the traffic of footage frame in, frame out, of a live televised genocide, frames of children, men, women shredded to ashla, dismembered body parts, their limbs picked from under the rubble, of mothers wailing the death of their beloveds, of infrastructure of life flattened. Maybe because the everyday labor of life, in spite of all attempts to curtail it, is a practice of, to use Khalida Jarrar's words, impending freedom. In fact, it is, as Salamanca, Hosla, and Arori state, it is Palestinians' refusal to give up on life that threatens the core of Zionist supremacy. Sperm smuggling, now I move to the article. Leaking out of a body into a candy wrapper, a plastic ballpoint, pen, or a bottle, unidentifiable to the lenses of security cameras, hidden underneath layers of clothes subjected to thorough searches, moved past the armed guards and highly securitized gates of the prison, through to occupied villages and across militarized checkpoints, and finally reaching the fertility clinic before it is hosted by the political prisoners' wives of them through assisted reproductive technologies. This is the journey of a specimen of semen smuggled out of an Israeli prison, a journey in which the viscous matter circumvents the carceral barriers of the settler colonial state that subjects Palestinian prisoners to a state of capture. The movement of fluids from bodies to bodies through assisted human and technological means and across settler security apparatuses is a journey in which precarious bodies, matter, and environments enter a web of codependency and relationality to sustain life in circumstances where life is made unlivable. More than a defiant reproductive practice, I argue in this talk today that sperm smuggling enacts an affirmation of life that refuses submission to the totalizing hold of physical, social, and political death. The practice of sperm smuggling emerges in a context where reproductive injustices against Palestinians are daily occurrences of life under Israeli settler colonialism. And we've seen the reproductive warfare intensify in the last year and a half in Gaza. The legal, social, and militarized targeting of Palestinian mothers and children, the mass incarceration and killing of Palestinian men, and the attack on infrastructures of livability are Israeli bio and necropolitical strategies of incapacitating the conditions necessary for the sustenance and reproduction of life in Palestine. The manifold ways in which reproduction is deliberately attacked expose a settler fantasy and a project of eradicating the natives' capacity to live on, and serve as a particular bio and necropolitical function tied to Israel's colonial project of population management, where the settler ideology of demographic competition frames Palestinian reproduction as a security threat. As well as targeting attacks on the figure of the mother and the child, attacks on reproduction include the bombardment of maternity wards in hospitals, as we've seen in Gaza recently, the refusal to grant newborn ID cards, controlling access to medical supplies, and impediments to movements and checkpoints in emergency situations, including childbirth. All of these practices testify to how colonial violence affects reproduction on both the structural and the cellular levels. The counterpart of these strategies that seek to curtail Palestinian reproduction are those that seeks to optimize and administer Israeli Jewish life through government legislations and policies. This is evident in state incentives meant to encourage Israeli Jewish reproduction by ensuring budget allocations, access to healthcare, assisted reproductive technologies, and medical insurance. And there's been a recent study actually that shows that the highest rates of IVF procedures per capita are to be found in Israel. Such incentives are further consolidated through public discourses that frame Palestinian reproduction as a demographic and security threat, and to use the words of Nader Shalhoub Kevorkian, of the Palestinian womb as a threat to be curtailed. Israeli reproductive futurism, while remaining committed to the reproduction of Israeli Jewish life, simultaneously sanctions Palestinian death and debilitation. Against this backdrop, I argue that the practice of sperm smuggling circumvents settler colonial efforts to curtail the reproduction of life and inaugurates a practice of life-making and a conception of life beyond its adjudication in the language of rights and the right to life. To further elaborate on this, I refer to the political prisoner Walid al-Daqqa's statement that the birth of his daughter Milad, of sperm smuggled from Ayalon prison, constitutes a claim to the right to life. I analyze the claim in relation to two scenes, that of political violence. What does it mean to claim the right to life in a context in which life is being subjected to forms of political violence and death? And what does it mean to claim the right to life in relation to reproduction? So I look at this question in relation to both of these scenes simultaneously. And I particularly build on the work of Judith Butler, who's one of the philosophers who actually did bring this question of right to life in relation to those specific scenes. So taking cue from Butler's work, I expose the pitfalls of understanding Daqqa's claim to the right to life only in relation to the recognition or the suspension of the law, or as a pro-natalist call for procreation per se. For these frames disregard the ethical and political dimensions of the practice of sperm smuggling as an affirmation of life. Sperm smuggling, as I will show, as an affirmative act disrupts the status to which Palestinian existence is reduced, namely to the status of a living death, and whose recognition as a life is only secured before the law. Sperm smuggling, I argue, is a practice that mobilizes the collective will to sustain reproductive relations and regenerate life where individual and collective sovereignties are breached and violated on a daily basis. So I want to here refer to a quote by Walid al-Daqqa, a political prisoner, a freedom fighter, a novelist, and a writer, who had served in prison for 38 years and died from medical negligence in prison in April 2024. His body is still held up until now by the Israeli prison authorities, and recently it has come out that Israel wants to use his body, the release of his body, as a bargaining chip in the hostage exchange with Hamas. So I will start by reading a quote by him written in 2009. This quote, this is from a letter that he wrote to Milad, his unborn child, but it is written in the voice of Milad. So as you're reading this, remember that this is written in the voice of Milad, his unborn child. Ad-Daqqa writes, I'm not scared of this government and its hubris, not because I'm fearless, nor because I have faith that the preciousness of childhood will be recognized, but simply because I stand above them, ethically speaking, as someone possessed of a right, the right of even the simplest of creatures, which is the right to life. They make death, and I am the labor of life. And here I ask you, what is insanity? Is it insanity that a child of my age speaks, or that the Shabak, the Israeli security agency, has opened a file on her even before she is born? Walid and his wife and comrade Sana Salameh conceived Milad through sperm smuggling in 2019 after a long battle with prison authorities and a smear campaign against the couple in Israeli media. Milad's conception was met with disdain by the Israeli state, so much so that the Israeli security intelligence issued a warning against Milad's birth. Daqqa's words about Milad's right to life, echoed in many news articles that cover the practice of sperm smuggling, reorient our engagement with questions of rights, life, and reproduction. Pointing to the absurdity of the situation, the absurdity of the speech act of an unborn child, the absurdity of a racist regime that opens a surveillance file for a fetus, Daqqa's statement attempts to distill a fundamental claim that is yet to be realized: the right to life. They make death, and I am the labor of life. Daqqa was one of over 9,000 Palestinian political prisoners, predominantly men, still held in Israeli prisons for committing security offenses, 3,000 of which have been arrested since October the 7th. The security grounds that allegedly permit arrest and imprisonment range from organizing and participating in demonstrations to throwing stones or killing Israeli soldiers. Many of the imprisoned and detained, classified by the Israeli prison services as security prisoners, are deprived of basic rights, including the rights to a fair and regular trial and to medical care, and are subjected to inhumane treatment. Additionally, many political prisoners from 1967 occupied Palestinian territories are held in Israeli prison in violation of international law, which forbids the transfer of prisoners outside occupied land. Security and securitization become expansive technologies of control systematically mobilized to arrest, imprison, and impose hyper-restrictions, including the rejection of permits for family visits. For those whose permits are granted, visits are restricted to 45 minutes, and prisoners and their visitors are most often separated by a screen. Despite multiple demands by prisoners, conjugal visits remain forbidden. As Daqqa writes in another letter entitled Parallel Time, written in 2005, 15 years before the birth of his daughter Milad, the target of the jailer is not just the prisoner's political being, it is their social being. The target is any relationship you can have outside of yourself, with other people, with nature. The target is love. Daqqa continues, I confess that I'm still a person holding on to love, as if it were embers. I will remain steadfast in this love. I will continue to love you, for love is my humble and only victory over my jailer. In 2020, Daqqa and Sana''s daughter, Milad, meaning birth in Arabic, was born. The first reported case of childbirth from sperm smuggled from an Israeli prison is that of Muhannad al-Zaban, born to Dalal al-Zaban and Ammar al-Zaban in August 2012. The birth of Muhannad, whose father Ammar is serving a life sentence in Hadarim prison, represented a miraculous event of defiance in the face of a grim reality of everyday colonial violence in occupied Palestine. Since then, it has been reported that over 110 children have been conceived in the same way from across different governorates of occupied Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the occupied interior. What was at first deemed a miracle became a phenomenon involving the use of reproductive technology, referred to as tahrib al-nutaf, a practice that is recognized socially and legally authorized through religious rulings and fatwas. The most recent reported case before the genocidal onslaught on Gaza was the birth of quadruplets to the political prisoner Ahmad al-Shamali and Rasmiya al-Shamali in March 2023. Rasmiya and her children up until then resided with her children in Shaja'iyya in Gaza City. Going back to Daqqa's claim to a right to life, what does it mean to make such a claim through reproduction from captivity? Even just composing a question that brings both the right to life and reproduction into a single sentence inevitably calls for a critical assessment of rights and reproductive freedoms as nodes of inquiry. What makes the claim to life a righteous claim? And how does the claim to a right to life traverse the moral codes associated with debates that pit pro-choice perspectives against pro-life ones? How does this right to life circumvent the bio and necropolitical coordinates of the settler colonial state? In their book, Frames of War, Butler raises the question of the right to life in connection with reproduction to signal a certain reluctance on the left to think about the discourse of life given its predominant framing through the pro-life and pro-choice opposition. In attempting to address this apprehension, Butler brings the two scenes, that of reproduction and that of war, together as a way to retrieve thinking about life that complicates the notion of the right to life as a universal given. In their critique, Butler argues that no entity, human or non-human, has ever been granted a right to life by virtue of its aliveness. There's no mere life that is ontologically granted protection. Rather, life always already enters the political and social fields and is conditioned by it. So rather than claim the right to life for mute embryos, Butler urges us to think beyond the moral domain that sees embryos within the frame of ontogenetic personhood, and to consider life as pervasively social and political, that is, life as dependent on social and biopolitical relations that both sustain or delimit reproducibility. This, Butler warns in earlier work, should not deter us from struggling for bodily autonomy and self-determination, be it in relation to reproductive freedoms or in conditions of political and economic duress under occupation and colonialism, but should encourage us to acknowledge the public dimension of our embodiment, which is inevitably bound to others and to modes of governmentality that can sustain, but also violate us. In extending this discussion to the conditions of war and political violence, Butler contends that no right to life as a universal given has ever been able to ward off violence, endurability, and death. We can talk about the inalienable right to life, but we know that, that modes of governmentality still determine whose lives are worthy of protection and whose not. Rights are granted and stripped away by operations of governmentality that instrumentalize bio and necropower to decide who lives and who dies, whose lives are secured through protection and whose are not. Butler is therefore interested in disarticulating the struggle for the universal right to life from anti-war politics and the critique of political violence. So they're kind of saying that this kind of struggle for the right to life by anti-war activists and anti-war politics can slip into a struggle for legal and political protections. As important as they are, rights reduce our understanding of what life is and can be, making this complex question as a matter of its standing before the law. So when we say, we're fighting for the right to life through a kind of a more of an anti-war politics, we're claiming, or we're kind of asking for some form of legal and political protection. So our kind of quest for that right becomes a struggle for legal and political protection. As important as that is, it limits our understanding to what life is and can be, to its standing before the law. Of course, this is in no way meant to undermine the importance of struggling for legal and political rights. Instead, this account seeks to expose the paradox at stake in doing so. In the context of Palestine, it does not require a leap of imagination to account for the instances when the law, both state and international law, is complicit in the exercise of state-sanctioned violence against Palestinians through occupation, dispossession, statelessness, imprisonment, death, and debilitation of life. Despite the appearance of numerous accounts of its violations of human rights and international law, Israel, until today, continues its settler colonial projects against Palestinians with international impunity. These violations and the fact that Palestinians are deprived these violations and the fact that Palestinians are deprived of a recognized legal and political status in the 1967 occupied Palestinian territories and are regarded as second-class citizens in Israel inevitably calls for the struggle for rights, if not the right to have rights. Nevertheless, if we understand the claim to the right to life only in terms of the law and its suspension, we are missing on the social, political, and ethical stakes of what it means to affirm life otherwise. We're also missing on the claim to justice that is invoked in the Arabic word for right, haq. Walid al-Daqqa's letter, originally written in Arabic, refers to milad's haqqun fil hayat, where haq signals a call for truth and justice that is not per se answerable through the law. The extra-legal meaning of the Arabic word haq as truth and justice gestures towards an ethically and a politically imminent view of rights that, although it can be central to the struggle for justice in legal terms, exceeds the limits of the law. Haq here is also conceived in the words of Humayra Iqtidar as a set of practices that foreground social relations and a deep entwining of social responsibilities and obligations, which, as we will see, the practice of sperm-smuggling interpolates individual and collective will to regenerate life through establishing forms of social relations around the child and so haq as truth-seeking endeavor that interpolates individual and collective will to regenerate life. When considering reproduction through sperm smuggling as a claim to a right to life, I want to make two key points. First, it would be misguided to consider the practice of sperm smuggling as bound to a pro-life discourse. Daqqa's claim to a right to life is not a claim for procreation per se, but in the broader register of a life made unlivable. It is an insistence on life that takes shadows and that takes place in the shadow of the prison and the broader social context that supports reproductive relations, in spite of settler efforts to curtail it. The stories and news of the sperm smuggling trickling out to communities across Gaza, the West Bank, and the occupied interior have consolidated new forms, new social bonds, and created conditions that sustain the proliferation of the practice. From the involvement of doctors and nurses at fertility clinics like Al-Razan in Nablus and Al-Basma, which unfortunately has been flattened in December of last year, in Gaza, offering IVF treatments pro bono, to forms of sociality and collectivity organized around the social reproductive labor of bearing children, forms of communal kinship have emerged that exceed the heteronormative units of reproduction in the family. Second, the claim to a right to life is not a claim to rights as much as it is a claim to a life that traverses the threshold of unlivability, an insurgent Palestinian life, so to speak. The claim to a right to life here is a claim that speaks in multiple tongues. It addresses the international community in its universalizing language of rights from which Palestinians continue to be denied access, while also refusing to treat the struggle for life as strictly bound to the premises of rights and the law. So beyond the claim of a right to life, the practice of sperm smuggling, as well as the reproductive relations that break through the colonial capture, are affirmative acts that emerge from conditions of reproductive debilitation. The bodies, environments, and social bonds that sustain this reproduction are particularly precarious and vulnerable to political violence. And so in this context, one might ask, why insist on bringing a child into a context in which colonial wounding and death world structure the everyday under settler colonialism? But one might also reverse the question and ask, what becomes of a place and a struggle if one succumbs to death as a totalizing reality? Attending to sperm smuggling, the reproductive relations that sustain it as affirmations of life opens up the discussion to the ethical and political social and political stakes of the practice, where affects, desires, and imaginations can envision future interior freedoms unimaginable in the midst of a life made bare. Against the Israeli state's repeated investment in Palestinian death, fast and slow, the smuggling of sperm is an affirmative gesture in which the prisoner, their wives, their children, and the social relations organized around them obstinately affirm life in this extraordinary state and by extraordinary means. The different forms that capture takes, capture as incarceration, capture as colonial violences hold at the most intimate and molecular level, capture as the arrest of movement behind bars, through separation walls and across checkpoints, capture as entrapment in the alternation between life and death, are circumvented, but ultimately not yet overcome. They are circumvented through a breaking out, a leak that disorients the violent events of incarceration. Sperm smuggling is an opening towards a futurity that the Israeli state is adamant about foreclosing. The rhetoric of futurity in Palestinian public discourse, which hails children born of sperm smuggling as ambassadors of freedom, might be read in Lauren Berlon's sense as attesting to a cruelly optimistic attachment to a fantasy that assigns the figure of the child the position of the bearer of a future of freedom. The figure of the ambassador of freedom might also be misconstrued as the messenger of a scripted future, as a positive investment in birthing the nation. I contend, however, that it is the symbolic significance and the social significance of the practice of sperm smuggling as an affirmative, ethical, and political practice rather than the figure of the child per se that conjures the possibility of a future of freedom from the colonial present. The life of an infant, a life deemed impossible under conditions of incarceration, is socially upheld as a life that will have been lived in dignity and freedom. This is what Butler calls life's future anteriors. That is, the presupposition that this will be a life that has been lived and therefore will be a life recognized as a life and sustained as such. The child who is conceived against all odds and in spite of conditions of debilitation belongs to a growing generation one that for Palestinians signals the possibility of a freedom that will have been lived and that is yet on the horizon. And I would like to close with a couple of remarks. Since writing this article, the question of what grammars of futurity await the next generation of Palestinian children and youth, a question that has haunted us for decades, has become the more urgent and yet the more difficult to ponder upon. As of today, more than 51,439 Palestinians have been confirmed killed and 117,416 wounded in Gaza. It is estimated that almost half of the killed and injured are children. What we see today on our news feeds and on screens exposes a whole level of international complicity, a complicity that is bent on the extermination of a population of 2.2 million people concentrated in an open-air prison and have nowhere to go. Earlier, I mentioned how at least 110 children have been born through sperm smuggling, many of whom have been conceived through artificial insemination and IVF and born in Gaza. Today, I'm confronted with not knowing if these children are dead or alive. What happened to the quadruplets of Rasmiya al-Shamali and political prisoner Ahmed al-Shamali from Shuja'iyya in Gaza? In December 2023, Israel bombed Gaza's largest fertility clinic, Basma Clinic, that, as I mentioned earlier, offered pro bono treatments to couples separated by imprisonment. The attack destroyed more than 4,000 embryos and 1,000 specimens of sperm and eggs stored in the IVF clinic. For most of these couples who relied on the clinic for their plans for parenthood, this was their last chance at getting pregnant. The scale of reproductive warfare committed against Palestinians has been, in the last 18 months, unfathomable, to say the least. A warfare that is bent on the elimination of the Palestinians' capacity to reproduce life both biologically and socially, and that is not always reflected in the death count. Early April last year, after 38 years in Israeli custody, the political prisoner Walid al-Daqqa died in Ayalon prison. His lawyer, who visited him a few weeks before his death, reported that Al-Daqqa has been subjected to torture and deprived of the required medical care to attend to his stage of cancer. His family were not informed of his death. They learned about it through social media. Until today, Al-Daqqa's body is held by the Israeli prison authorities. Israel announced recently that it, as I mentioned earlier, will hold his body as a bargaining chip for negotiations with Hamas. Daqqa, a political prisoner who invoked the right to life through his daughter Milad, is denied the right to a dignified death and burial in Palestinian land. Even in the event of death, the capture of Al-Daqqa's body represents the jailer's attempt to capture the communal fortitude his ceremonial mourning will evoke. I would like to end here with a quote by Bassel al-Araj, an activist and intellectual who was killed by the IOF in 2017. I'm quoting him here from an article entitled Exiting Law and Entering Revolution, where he states, "The principle of every revolution is exit, an exit from the law. Against all forms of enclosure, be it through exit from a besieged life in the strip, or exit from the hold of the prison through sperm-smuggling. These are exits that enact a practice of freedom against all odds and in spite of colonial death worlds." Thank you.